For my reaction when my husband and mother-in-law humiliated me over an apron? I had been in the kitchen for hours, trying to finish serving everyone after hosting a long family gathering with guests still chatting in the living room. He did not say it as a joke or in a quiet voice. He said it loudly, in front of his mother and the remaining guests, treating me like hired help in the very home we shared. The way he looked at me was not simply angry. It was filled with contempt, as if he truly believed that was my only place. And his mother, sitting by the counter, let out a comfortable, knowing laugh, clearly enjoying the moment. Then came the comment meant to cut even deeper, as he added that there was a reason I had not been able to start a family with him, that a woman who could not manage her role in the home was also unfit to build a life together. The words came out cold and measured, aimed to cause the exact pain he intended. I did not cry. I did not answer, and I did not look away, because inside me something had stopped breaking long ago and had settled into a calm that had been growing for some time. While he kept talking about the house as if it belonged only to him, I heard the front door open behind me and the atmosphere in the room shifted without them noticing. My father stepped in quietly, walked straight to the table, and placed a thick folder on the wood. The laughter stopped the moment my mother-in-law opened it. Seeing what was inside, she turned pale and whispered, "Son, not that." My mother-in-law did not finish reading the entire folder. She barely glanced at the first few pages before slamming it shut, as if touching those papers in front of everyone burned her. But my husband, curious and annoyed by her reaction, snatched it from her hands without asking, convinced that nothing from my side of the family could truly affect him. I remember his expression perfectly as he flipped through the documents. At first he frowned, then let out a short, disbelieving laugh, as if this were nothing more than a desperate attempt to scare him. He looked up at me with that same arrogant confidence he always showed when he thought he held all the control. Right there in front of his mother, he began to mock me. He said no stack of papers was going to change what was already his, that he had maintained this house, and that with or without the marriage, nothing and no one was going to force him out, least of all me, who, in his words, had never contributed anything except problems and expenses. His mother, slowly regaining her composure, smiled again and supported him as always, saying I was only making a scene because I knew it would soon be my turn to leave. The conversation turned even harsher when they mentioned that once everything was settled, he could finally rebuild his life without any burdens. They shamelessly hinted that there was already someone else who knew how to make him happy, someone who, according to his mother, was ready to build the family I had not been able to give him. They never said her name, but they did not need to. The way they looked at each other made it clear that this other woman already occupied a place that had once been mine. I stayed silent, listening as they talked about the future inside that very house, planning changes, redecorations, and even celebrations they would hold once everything was legally cleared. They were certain the folder contained nothing that could stop their plans. My calm began to bother them more than any complaint ever had. It was my mother-in-law who commented in a low voice, thinking I could not hear, that my attitude seemed strange, that no woman about to lose everything looked so peaceful. My husband replied that it did not matter, that this serenity was only a front, and that in the end I would end up begging once I realized I had nowhere to go. They could not imagine that this folder was not an empty threat or an emotional outburst. It was simply the first piece of something that had been quietly prepared for a long time, long before they decided to humiliate me in my own kitchen, believing they controlled my future. My husband opened the folder again, this time more calmly, as if he wanted to prove there was nothing inside that could pull the rug out from under him. But as he moved through the pages, his expression lost its mocking edge and began to tighten in a way he tried to hide from his mother. He did not understand everything he was reading, that was clear, but there were account statements, recorded transfers, and bank movements he did not remember authorizing, all tied directly to the property where we lived. What bothered him most were not the amounts but the dates, because several transactions had taken place months earlier, even before the biggest problems between us started. That shattered any idea that this was a last-minute reaction. He tried to brush it off, saying it was surely just routine bank procedures or administrative adjustments that did not need his attention, but his tone no longer convinced even his own mother. He kept turning pages quickly, searching for something to support his version, until he found a certified copy of the property deed with legal notes that had not been there the last time he saw it. He stayed silent for a few seconds, reading an entire clause, then going back to the beginning as if he wanted to be sure he was not misunderstanding. His mother noticed the change and asked what was wrong, but he did not answer right away. He only partially closed the folder and looked toward me with a new mix of doubt and irritation, as if he was beginning to suspect my calm was no coincidence. He tried to resume the mockery, saying papers could be forged and none of it was valid without his recent signature, though he avoided reading aloud what he had just found. That small silence, that pause he refused to explain, was the first real crack in the victory they had been celebrating only minutes earlier. Inside that folder there were no raised voices, no threats, and no emotional scenes, only cold documents that began to suggest something much more serious, something they did not yet fully understand but that already carried the weight of a carefully prepared legal process. And this was only the first sign. My husband opened the folder for a third time, no longer with his earlier confidence, turning the pages more carefully now, as if afraid to confirm what he was starting to suspect. He stopped again at the certified copy of the deed, reading every line completely this time, without skipping anything. That was when his silence lost its arrogance and became heavy. The clause in front of him was not recent or thrown together on the spot. It had been registered months earlier, notarized, and carried official stamps that left little room for easy explanations. He searched for his name in the ownership section, certain he would appear as the main title holder. But the more he read, the clearer it became that something did not match the story he had always told. His mother, anxious from the lack of answers, asked him to read it aloud, and he, uncomfortable, tried to summarize it without details, saying it was only administrative adjustments related to the family property. The tension in his jaw gave him away. She, growing nervous, took the page from him to read it herself. The change in her face was immediate and far more obvious than before, because now there was no doubt possible. The house where we lived, the same one he had used to humiliate me minutes earlier, was no longer registered in his name or under shared control as he believed. The transfer had been completed well in advance through an asset protection arrangement that prevented any sale, mortgage, or use as collateral without the sole authorization of the new title holder. She checked the document again, looking for the name. When she found it, her hands trembled slightly. The property could not be touched, could not be divided, and above all could not be treated as a shared marital asset. For the first time since the humiliation had begun in the kitchen, neither of them had anything to say. The silence that filled the house was no longer mocking. It was genuine fear as they realized they had been celebrating a victory on ground that no longer belonged to them. The silence from that discovery had not yet settled when the doorbell rang again, breaking the tension inside the house. This time it was not a family visit or an everyday errand. My husband, still holding the folder, walked toward the door trying to regain his composure, convinced nothing could make the situation worse than what he had just read. When he opened it, he found two men in suits accompanied by a woman carrying an official briefcase. They identified themselves with professional formality, stated his full name, and asked to come inside to serve legal notices related to the property. The confidence in their voices made his tone shift immediately from arrogant to defensive in a matter of seconds. He tried to block their entry, saying it was not a good time and that any notification should come through proper legal channels, but one of them showed stamped documents authorizing the delivery right then and there, explaining that it had to be done in person to create an official record. His mother watched anxiously from the hallway as the visitors stepped into the living room and asked everyone present to stay, so they could hear the full notification. I remained silent exactly where I was, watching the confidence that had filled the house only minutes earlier begin to crumble without me saying a single word. The woman with the briefcase opened her folder and began to read in a clear voice. She explained that, due to certain financial movements, asset transfers, and previously registered protective clauses, a process was being started to freeze assets linked to my husband's name within the residence. He interrupted several times, claiming it had to be a mistake and that the house was already protected, but the document she held confirmed exactly the opposite. The property was legally shielded, but not in his favor. The notice also included an order for a full review of assets because of possible financial irregularities tied to shared accounts, along with an immediate deadline to provide proof of origin for certain funds used during the marriage. Every word landed heavier than the last because these were not assumptions. They were already authorized steps that did not need his approval to move forward. He looked toward his mother for support, but she stood pale, gripping the back of a chair, understanding that this was no longer a family disagreement or an emotional threat. The legal representatives had not come to negotiate. They had come to enforce the process. The notification ended, and the silence that followed felt different from all the earlier ones, because it was no longer filled with doubts, but with real consequences no one in the room knew how to stop. My husband tried to absorb what he had just heard, reviewing the documents again as if reading them more times would change the content, while his mother stood motionless, unable to form a defense. It was then that I decided to speak, not with anger or raised voices, but with the same calm I had shown since the humiliation began in the kitchen, a calm that now made sense in their eyes. I told them that none of what was happening had been sudden. Every document, every transfer, and every clause had been prepared long before they imagined they could push me out of my own life without consequences. I spoke aloud about the late nights he claimed were for work while I discovered deleted messages, the outings that did not match his schedule, and the expenses he could never explain. For a long time I had doubted my own instincts until I stopped doubting and began quietly gathering evidence, not for revenge but for protection. I told them about the other woman he had hinted at earlier, confirming that she had been part of his life for months and had even tried to access shared accounts, using the situation to gain financial benefits. His face changed when he realized I knew far more than he had thought, but he did not interrupt. I explained that once I confirmed the inappropriate relationship and the financial irregularities, I had sought legal advice to protect my assets before any debts, claims, or disputes could reach them. The transfer of the property had not been impulsive. It was a preventive step based on documented evidence that had already been recorded when he still trusted me enough to sign without carefully reviewing. His mother tried to interrupt, saying I was exaggerating, but it was enough for me to mention the altered records he had used to avoid certain financial responsibilities for her to fall silent again. I never raised my voice because there was no need. Every truth I shared was supported by something already inside that folder or in the hands of the representatives who had just delivered the notice. I looked straight at him and said the words that had been forming inside me for years, without hatred, only with firmness. I have been preparing for this for years. And for the first time he understood that the calm that had bothered him so much was not weakness. It was preparation. After I finished speaking, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to unsteady, as if the ground had moved beneath their feet without warning. My husband tried to react quickly, denying every point with arguments that did not even convince him, saying everything could be cleared up if he simply spoke with his lawyers to stop the process. He asked urgently for his phone and began making calls in front of everyone, pacing back and forth while explaining pieces of the situation and carefully avoiding details that pointed directly to him. But his expression changed with every answer he received. It was not the confidence of someone defending what was his. It was the anxiety of someone realizing the decisions were no longer in his hands. His mother also panicked, asking who they could contact and mentioning people they knew at banks or friends who she believed could fix the problem if they acted quickly. The same legal representatives who had delivered the notice remained present, watching in professional silence and making it clear that the process did not depend on personal connections. During one of the calls, he stepped far enough away that he thought I would not hear, but his tone changed completely when the lawyer on the other end confirmed that the registered clauses on the property were solid, properly notarized, and that reversing them would require a long and costly court battle with very little chance of success. He tried to insist, asking if he could at least pause the asset freeze while everything was sorted out. The answer was even clearer because they explained that the protective measures were already in motion, and given the detected irregularities, there was no immediate way to stop them. When he hung up, he avoided looking at me and turned his frustration back to the documents, searching for any technical mistake that could save him. His mother wanted to argue that I was overreaching, and that no one could plan something like this without leaving legal openings, but one of the representatives calmly explained that everything had already been reviewed by notaries and financial authorities. There were no openings, no errors, and no quick way out. For the first time since this had all begun, the fear was no longer mine. It had shifted entirely to them. The panic still hung in the air when the legal representatives informed them that the notification was only the start of the process, and that immediate steps had to be taken that same day to carry out the authorized asset freeze. My husband tried to stop them, demanding time to explore his options, but they explained that the deadline had begun the moment the order was issued and could not be delayed. Minutes later, more people arrived, this time with personnel responsible for cataloging assets inside the home that were tied to his name. The scene moved beyond legal paperwork and became deeply uncomfortable, because they began walking through the house, noting furniture, electronics, artwork, and even the vehicles registered under his ownership. His mother could not believe what she was seeing and asked if this was some kind of asset seizure, if they planned to clear out the house, but they clarified it was a preventive freeze on his assets, which in practice meant many of those items could not be used, sold, or transferred until the process ended. I remember how he followed behind them, trying to justify each item, saying some had been purchased before the marriage or were family gifts, desperately trying to shorten the list. Every argument was met with documents they already had on file. The tension grew when they notified him that the vehicles were also restricted and asked for the keys and paperwork to add them to the official inventory. His face changed completely as he realized this was no longer just about papers or accounts but about visible, everyday things slipping out of his control right in front of me. What had been the setting for his command to put on the apron was now filled with strangers cataloging his belongings with professional detachment. His mother went from arrogance to pleading, asking for consideration and trying to blame me loudly for what was happening, but no one responded to her protests because everything followed a previously authorized procedure. I watched in silence, not with satisfaction but with a sense of necessary closure, understanding that the humiliation they had started could no longer be halted. The house they had used to make me feel small was beginning to feel far too large for them. After the procedures inside the house ended, the silence that remained was heavier than any earlier argument, because there were no more raised voices or insults, only concrete consequences no one could ignore. The restrictions on assets, accounts, and vehicles forced immediate changes, and for the first time my husband had to face something he had never considered. He could not continue the lifestyle he had always used as a symbol of control. For days he tried to resolve everything through hurried calls and meetings, leaving early and returning late, his face growing more tired and his posture more defeated, as if the weight of the situation was showing physically as well. His mother, who had once spoken so confidently about my future outside the house, now paced the rooms doing calculations, wondering how long they could manage before the financial limits caught up with them completely. Reality forced them to cut expenses right away, cancel services, sell items that were not frozen, and search for cash where there had once been only comfort. Without free access to the vehicles or several accounts, getting around the neighborhood and city became a daily struggle they had never imagined. The breaking point came when they realized they could not keep living there under those conditions, not because the house itself was in dispute, since that was already settled, but because maintaining it financially without their usual resources had become impossible. The house they had defended as a symbol of dominance began to feel like a structure too large for a life that had suddenly grown much smaller. They ended up moving temporarily to a much smaller rental they found in a hurry, far from the neighborhood where they had once displayed their stability. There were no graceful goodbyes or organized moving day. Only hastily packed boxes, half-closed suitcases, and the discomfort of knowing the neighbors had quietly watched their former confidence disappear. I remember seeing them leave that last day, not from the front door but from the upstairs window, watching them load what little they could take without restrictions. His mother kept her eyes down and walked quickly, as if she wanted to vanish from the moment, while he maintained a hard expression, trying to hold on to a dignity that had nothing left to support it. The contrast was impossible to miss. The world outside continued as always, cars driving by, people laughing, businesses open, life moving forward without pausing for their personal situation. For them, everything seemed caught in an awkward pause where every choice meant giving up something they had once taken for granted. It was not a dramatic removal or public scene, but the emotional impact ran even deeper because they understood they had lost more than assets. They had lost their position, their control, and the story of superiority they had built. And as they began that quiet departure, carrying suitcases that weighed less than the shame they carried inside, I knew there was still one final encounter left, the one that would bring everything to a complete close. Several months passed after they left the house, months in which there was no direct contact because the legal process followed its own course, creating a distance that, far from troubling me, gave me space to rebuild without constant noise around me. During that time, I focused on sorting out not only my financial situation but also my personal life, taking on projects I had set aside for years to support a marriage that had existed only in appearance. I returned to work with a different energy, not because I had to but because I chose to, reclaiming parts of myself I had left behind to fit into a relationship that had asked me to become smaller. I also moved out temporarily while renovations on the property were completed, turning spaces that had once been filled with tension into places where I could finally breathe without feeling watched or judged. I did not expect to see him again so soon, but the encounter happened when I least expected it, at a court hearing needed to finalize one of the remaining procedures. I arrived early and calm, dressed with a confidence that no longer needed to be forced because it had become part of who I was. When he walked in accompanied by his mother, the difference between who we had been months earlier was impossible to ignore. His posture was no longer rigid or commanding. He moved cautiously, reviewing documents as if every page might bring more unwelcome news. His mother, quieter than ever, avoided meeting my eyes and stayed focused on a silence that stood in sharp contrast to the woman who had laughed while they humiliated me in my own kitchen months before. During the hearing, the resolutions we had already anticipated were formally confirmed, setting out the restrictions, financial obligations, and responsibilities he would carry for the long term. There were no arguments because even his side understood that overturning what had been established was not realistic. When the hearing ended, he tried to approach me to talk, not from arrogance this time but from a mix of frustration and regret that no longer held any power over me. He said things had gotten out of control, that he had never imagined it would go this far, and that if he had known what was truly at stake he would have acted differently. I listened without interrupting, not because I was interested but for my own sense of closure, understanding that the conversation was not about reconciliation but about easing his own conscience. When he finished, I stayed quiet for a few seconds before answering, without raising my voice or adding unnecessary sharpness, only with the firmness that had grown from everything I had been through. I told him that losing him had turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me, not out of bitterness but because his absence had forced me to rebuild from a stronger, clearer, and more dignified place than the one I had occupied while trying to hold together something that was already broken. His mother shifted uncomfortably and tried to speak, but there was no space left for late confrontations. The distance between our realities had grown too wide. Before I left, I mentioned that the house was nearly finished, that for the first time it truly felt like mine, not just on paper but in peace, and that I had chosen to fill it with new beginnings instead of old memories. There was no need to say more. As I turned and walked away, I knew the humiliation that had started with an apron was ending with my complete freedom. After that last conversation we never crossed paths again, and the distance that opened between us was not only physical but also emotional and final, free of any remaining ties. The legal processes continued until they were fully resolved, confirming every measure taken months earlier, and establishing the responsibilities he would face for years to come. While that unfolded, my life moved in the opposite direction, not rushing to prove anything but advancing from a peace I had never known inside that marriage. The house was finally ready after the renovations, but beyond the physical changes, what truly transformed the space was the absence of the tension that had once filled every corner. I chose every detail with care, not to show off stability but to create a place where I could feel secure, where each room represented a chapter one had moved past, rather than an open wound. I changed colors, adjusted layouts, opened windows that used to stay closed, letting in light that felt different now that it no longer had to pass through arguments or uncomfortable silences. The first night I spent there completely alone, I felt no fear or emptiness. I felt peace, a deep peace that did not depend on anyone else. I walked through the house in quiet recognition of spaces that had once been the setting for humiliation, and that now carried new meaning under my own story. Over time I also rebuilt my circle of support. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from and strengthened my relationship with my family, especially with my father, whose quiet help had been the turning point that let me regain control of my life without public drama or pointless acts of payback. I only heard about my former husband through occasional distant remarks, accounts that spoke of ongoing debts, unsuccessful attempts to regain stability, and a relationship that had not lasted under the weight of the same patterns with which it had started. His mother, according to what people said, had moved to a much more modest place, far from the circles where she had once displayed her security. I felt no joy in hearing it, nor any pity, because I understood that everyone eventually lives with the results of their own choices, just as I was living with mine, but from an entirely different place. One afternoon, as the workers finished installing a new front door, one of them handed me the final set of clean and used keys. I held them for a few seconds before trying them, listening to the smooth sound of the lock turning. It was a simple sound, yet it represented everything I had reclaimed. I closed the door behind me, not as someone shutting themselves away but as someone protecting what they had carefully rebuilt. From the window I could see the quiet, well-lit garden, peaceful and free of any unwelcome shadows. And for the first time I understood that I had not lost a marriage. I had recovered my dignity, because in the end those who had thought me weak had mistaken silence for submission, patience for ignorance, and calm for an inability to act. They had underestimated the woman they once ordered to put on the apron, never imagining she also knew how to secure her own freedom. Comment. I wanted to share a few thoughts with you after this story. It always moves me to see someone quietly choose their own peace and self-respect. No one should ever make you feel small or unworthy in your own life. Setting clear boundaries is one of the kindest things you can do for yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing we do is prepare in silence and respond with calm strength. Healing starts the moment we decide we deserve better and take responsibility for our future. I hope this encourages you to value your dignity and protect your heart. Be gentle with yourself as you go through tough seasons. Choosing peace over continued chaos is a beautiful form of self-love. Thank you for spending this time with me, and remember you're worthy of a calm and respectful life. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.